Hello and welcome to Views on News. I'm Jawad Tehami. Two-day 18th Summit of the leaders of a group of 20 was held in Indian capital, New Delhi. It ended with a joint declaration. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping did not attend the summit. Now, unlike last year's declaration in Indonesia's Bali, this joint declaration didn't condemn and mention Russia for the war, the conflicts in Ukraine. A Russian foreign minister was heading the delegation at the summit. Mr. Sergei Lavrov said, let me quote him, "Frankly, we didn't expect that. We were ready to defend our wording of the text, and the global south is no longer willing to be lectured," unquote. On the other side, we have seen the Ukrainian reaction. Ukraine's foreign ministry criticized the final statement for not mentioning Russia for the conflict over there with Ukraine, adding that the communique was nothing to be proud of. When we specifically talk about China, it although signed the joint declaration, but there was no further comment by the Chinese premier who was heading the delegation at the summit. We also know earlier China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, which is under the Ministry of State Security, criticized India for bringing geopolitical private goods onto the global stage, which it said will create further problems. Also at the summit, we saw Chinese Premier speaking with U.S. President Joe Biden and called for strengthening the communication between the two countries. Also, President Joe Biden responded by saying that the U.S. hopes to see the Chinese economy continue to grow and his country will not hinder it. Another major development at the summit was the inclusion of African Union in the bloc. Also what we have seen is that the United States, India, Saudi Arabia and the European Union have unveiled a multilateral rail and ports deal linking Middle East and South Asia. We'll be taking all these important points up for discussion in today's show. For that, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Dr. Hassan Daud. He's senior economist, a former project director of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and also associate professor at the Barrier University. Has served at prominent positions at various think tanks in Pakistan. Dr. Hassan, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. On Skype at the same time from Potsdam, Germany, we are being joined by Mr. Harley Schlanger. He's a political analyst. Mr. Schlanger, thank you very much for your time also for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. Dr. Hassan, if you allow me, let me begin the discussion with Mr. Schlanger. Mr. Schlanger, by looking at this particular joint declaration of this particular summit held in Indian capital, it wasn't expected earlier. How do you look at it?
Well, the most important thing is that the United States went there along with its NATO allies with an agenda, which was to get a denunciation of Russia for the continuation of the war in Ukraine. This didn't happen. And the U.S. press, nevertheless, is saying that there was an agreement that Russia's a problem. They highlight the fact that neither Xi Jinping nor Putin were there. But look, the reality is that there's a new development perspective that's taking over in the global south. And that's one which is going to defend Russia and China, because these are two countries that are standing in favor of the sovereignty of the global south, the nations of the global south, and for development, as opposed to the continuation of International Monetary Fund policies of neo-colonial looting of Africa and of the use of war to beat down their adversaries. So I think the outcome was generally pretty good. It showed that what happened at the Brics Summit 10 days ago or 12 days ago in Johannesburg, South Africa, is here to stay. The idea that there's an alternative development perspective. And I might add, as an American, it's somewhat embarrassing to see the proposal that was put forward for the counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, and embarrassing in the sense that why hasn't the U.S. been doing this before? 10 years ago, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced by Xi Jinping. Now, all of a sudden, Biden is discovering the need for corridors of development. Most of the world is looking at this and realizing the U.S. doesn't support this and has no money to back it up. They're going to try and get the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and others to pay for it. But it's not a serious proposal. And as a result, the Western efforts at the G20 summit fell short.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, when we talk about last year's summit in Indonesia's Bali, why do you think there was a huge difference when we talk about the joint declaration? In the previous one, there was a categorical and direct condemnation of Russia for its conflict with Ukraine. Also, at that time, Ukraine was invited at the summit. This time around, Ukraine was not invited. So how do you think the Western countries led by the U.S. Could concede to a joint declaration of this time around, which didn't contain the direct mention or the condemnation of Russian side?
Well, there's a rallying of nations of the global south for the idea of sovereignty and against the unipolar order. The days are over when the United States and its allies, or I should say its puppets, can dictate policy at international institutions. They may still control NATO. They still have a strong military. They're using institutions like the International Monetary Fund to blackmail countries into supporting them. But now we're seeing a new era of solidarity coming from the global south, which is reminiscent of what was attempted 50, 60 years ago with the non-aligned movement. But now, because of the strength of China's economy and Russia's military, these countries can now get support. And so they're no longer allowing themselves to be victims of the U.S. hegemon. So I think that's why the U.S. was not able to dictate the terms of the communique. And as Lavrov said to the press, look, read what's in the communique. You're making things up. You're printing gossip. The reality is that the situation has fundamentally changed since a year ago at the last G20 summit.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, one more thing related to this. There was a response by the Ukrainian foreign ministry also saying that there is nothing to be proud of regarding this particular final statement. How do you analyze that particular response by the Ukrainian side?
Well, I think the government in Kiev is a puppet of the United States and NATO. Without billions of dollars being funneled into the military in Ukraine, and also, by the way, a lot of that's going to the U.S. military-industrial complex. Without that money, Ukraine would not exist as a nation anymore. And so the fact that the Ukrainians don't like the fact that Russia wasn't condemned that's U.S. talking points. It's like the U.S. is the ventriloquist and Kiev is the puppet when it comes to these institutions. And all Zelensky will say is we need more weapons, more missiles, more capability to fight, and all that's doing is leading to more dead Ukrainians. So I think people can look at what Kiev said and realize that's coming from the United States.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, I'll come back to you to discuss this Ukrainian position regarding this joint declaration a little further. Let me bring in Dr. Hassan also into the discussion. Dr. Hassan, major development at this particular summit, the inclusion of the African Union, which has a combined GDP of $2.99 trillion, a grouping of 55 African countries. How initially do you look at it, and do you think there is any substantial role this particular bloc of African Union would be able to play at the G20 in future?
No, I think it is a significant movement in terms of inclusion of the African Union, and also in terms of countries, less developed countries, especially from global south, having an impact on global economy, and that's significant. And this is what Brics is all about. This is what originally G20 was about after the global economic crisis, and the origin of G20 was meant to have more countries, more inclusive growth. But I think overall, when you have African Union coming in, I think China should be happy with this. I think Russia should be happy, because overall in the context of developing countries and in terms of how relationship China has with the African countries, I think it's good news for them also, and I think it's good news for the world. But overall, in terms of the communique and also in terms of the larger impact that this G20 would have, I think it would not be as big as perhaps Bali was in for two reasons of it. One is the Ukrainian crisis, and I think you would soon hear more criticism flowing from the European Union and also from America, because it's a polarized world, and one bloc supports one agenda and the other always opposes it. But also for the reason is that when you talk of excluding a country like China and even Russia, which have significant impact on the global economy, I think the overall impact lessens. Even the Chinese premier was there, even the Russian foreign minister was there. I think the overall impact, because of the absence of two global leaders like Mr. Putin and also President Xi Jinping, was meaningful. I also think that for any statement that flows, if it has a political jargon attached to it, I think the overall impact would still be not as big as perhaps we would like.
So what sort of future impact do you think this particular absence of Chinese President Xi Jinping at this particular summit, as well as President of Russia, would have at this particular bloc? I
think at this time, as the world is opening up after the COVID-19 crisis and of course the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I think we need more unified blocs where economic integration, regionalism, globalization should come back to its own original shape, because the protectionist approach that the West has taken at least has shaken the world. It has actually impacted the world in a negative way. So now when we see countries coming forth for support of each other, G20, inclusion of Russian, African Union, I think the absence of Xi Jinping and Mr. Putin really was significant, and if they were present here, I think the impact would have been much larger, much impactful, because of the overall economic impact it would create. Now, yes, African Union coming in and the numbers are better, overall trade wise, G20 is already about 70% of the global trade, large 2/3 of the global population. But when China comes in a big number with its over 1.4 billion population, Russia comes, I think even a good impact on socio-economic development would have been significant. Now, I think it would not be as much as we would like.
So what sort of a role of the African Union as a member do you see in the coming days as far as the functioning of this particular bloc is concerned? As we all know that there are different economies within that particular region. Also, the priorities are different. They have different geopolitical agendas. Also, do you think there are the countries in Africa are going to work in unison to become an efficient member of the G20?
I think Africa within its own self and within the region and blocs, I think it's already polarized. There's political discussion already happening. There are political conflicts which are shaping the regions and actually headwinds because of these conflicts. So I think if better sense prevails and African Union looks at connecting and connections with the European Union, with the rest of the countries which are part of G20, I think what they can do is could be a bridge between China and United States, and in terms of their connection and their interest in that region. China wants to build its influence, America wants to build its influence, large, huge natural endowment in terms of the mineral resources, and also in terms of how geography plays its role within Africa. So I think if it plays its role well, if it actually leverages its connection with both the global north and also with China, I think it can play a major role and significant role, because at this time perhaps the outcome may not be as significant as it is, but I think going forward and when the next year G20 meetings happen and subsequent meetings happen, so perhaps in South Africa, when it happens, it would have a major impact.
Right. So that is exactly the point. Now, when we talk about the position of South Africa in this particular bloc, right, it happens to be one of the leading economies in the continent also. With the inclusion of this particular bloc of African Union into the G20, is there a sort of an impact that is expected on the positioning of South Africa within G20?
I think the major impact that flew, and in the last 10 days, I think the impact of Brics was significant, and how Brics was able to include countries which are more vital and more significant in terms of their economic and geopolitical role was important. And I think and I feel, based on the proceedings that I've seen and the communique that I've read, I think some of the outcome of this year's G20 was because of what happened in Brics meeting. Also how significant the role of South Africa was within that context also. And I think for that purpose, for them to have African Union in this larger G20 was also important. But I think going forward, and when you will compare both the events, I think Brics by large will overshadow going forward in the contribution that G20 would make.
So it carries more potential in future.
I think for me, Brics is much more powerful, and I think for us in Pakistan, I think we should look forward to be part of that maybe in 2 to 3 years' time.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, when we talk about Ukrainian Foreign Ministry's response that this communique, there is nothing to be proud of, do we make a sense out of this response that Ukraine at this point in history has started feeling isolated?
Well, let me pose it a little bit differently. It's my view and the view of the Schiller Institute that the reason there's a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is to stop the development of an alternative financial system outside of the control of Wall Street and the City of London. And what we saw with the Brics Summit was terribly discouraging to those financial interests that want to keep Africa as a source of colonial looting. And we've seen recently the coups against the pro-colonial governments in Gabon and Niger. We're seeing a new sense of courage and boldness coming from the African continent, which has tremendous raw material and resources, a very large and young population, but has been cut off from development. And so I think that the attack against Russia in Ukraine was designed to weaken Russia, as Defense Secretary Austin said. The threats against China around Taiwan are the same thing. They're trying to build up a global NATO to stop the development of this new just financial system outside of the control of the dollar. And so the Ukrainians, in a sense, are victims of this thing. You know, they're fighting Russia, but they're doing it on behalf of NATO and NATO interests, not the interests of Ukraine. Ukraine's interests would be to become part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the current government in Ukraine is a classic case of a puppet government that's been propped up by billions of dollars from the United States and NATO. And that's why they're not happy with the failure to condemn Russia at the G20 summit.
So what way forward do you look at for the Ukrainian side at this point in time?
Well, remember, Zelensky had already agreed to a negotiated settlement in the end of March and April last year. And it was Boris Johnson, as a messenger from NATO, said, don't sign it. The interest of Ukraine is to stop the fighting and instead to recognize that Ukraine must not allow itself to be a threat against Russia on behalf of NATO. And so if Ukraine were to accept terms of negotiated settlement and recognize that Crimea is not coming back, that eastern Ukraine is now with Russia, but the benefit for Ukraine would be investment as a transshipment point of part of the move of the Belt and Road Initiative into Europe. And this would also, by the way, be in the interest of countries like Germany, France, and Italy, who otherwise are following the U.S. Pied Piper down the road toward economic destruction. So Ukraine could step forward and say, we want to end this war, we want to protect what we have left, and instead the West is insisting that Ukraine fight and continue the fight against Russia.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, as you already mentioned, there could be a scenario and Ukraine should be go and vie for becoming the part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, here we saw the Chinese side giving a 12-point peace proposal regarding ending the conflict in Ukraine. After this particular development and the kind of response Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has given, Do you think it is time for the Ukrainian side to consider that 12-point peace proposal seriously, and after it considers it and go for ending the war or the conflict with Russia and then becoming the part of Belt and Road Initiative?
Absolutely, that's what they should do. And in fact, there have been peace initiatives coming from China, from President Lula of Brazil. The African Union sent representatives to both Kiev and Moscow for talks. And when they were in Moscow, Putin showed them the document that was already signed that would have been a negotiated settlement. So I think most of the world now sees that the Ukraine war is designed to weaken and contain Russia and, if possible, break Russia apart. And the only people who don't understand that are the Ukrainians themselves. And so the obvious, sensible response would be to accept the idea of a negotiated settlement. Also, the Vatican has said they could use their offices as part of unconditional negotiations. So everything's in place to end the war, except the fact that the West, in particular the United States, does not want to give up its unipolar status. And so there's a multipolar world that's come into existence, especially around the recent Brics Summit, and the West won't accept it, and instead they prefer war, targeting Russia, targeting China, trying to get Saudi Arabia away from China. Look, the Chinese got a negotiated agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's part of the new diplomacy and the new strategic architecture, which Washington and London will not tolerate.
Right. Dr. Hassan, when we talk about the economic impact of the conflict in Ukraine, what had been so far for the world at large and for Ukrainians themselves so far?
I think for me, the Russia-Ukraine crisis it's definitely wrong, but was at a wrong time also. You know, the world was opening up. We had terrible 2 years of COVID-19, a lot of lives lost, and then you have this political conflict disturbing the entire global supply chains. You know, the food supply chains were disrupted, economic order was disrupted, and then from a time where you should have where the world should have spoken about climate change, aggressive economic policies, inclusive growth, we were talking about politics and wars. And therefore, the better sense did not prevail. You know, Russia had its own point of view, Ukraine, and I think in the larger context, China played its cards well. You know, because China is friends to Russia, China has good relationship with Ukraine, and the way China dealt this conflict, and perhaps even Turkey, and were able to bring out results suiting both their own interests. I think that was significant. But for us, I think, and for developing world, which was already grappling the crisis because of climate change, floods in Pakistan and other countries, even in Africa, I think this Ukraine crisis was, as they say in boxing, was a hit below the belly, and it was at a wrong time. And when the food crisis happened, and that led to political crisis. And also, please remember, and I've been saying this all along, when you have a crisis because of climate change and poverty number grows, it has an impact on security, and you just can't put barriers on security, and that has an impact on the overall order. So if something happens in Ukraine, it does not stay in Ukraine, it does not stay in a particular region, it has its global dimensions and impact. And I think for us now, and for Ukraine in itself, and as my colleague highlighted, senior colleague highlighted, I think the Ukraine should now look at how to get out of this crisis, because the impact on Russia, of course, there is economic impact, there is, but I think the impact on and the number of lives lost in Ukraine are much more than what has happened to Russia. Now that this statement of G20 has come, I think it should open eyes of Ukraine, and they should find a settlement. And I also believe that going forward, the only way we can achieve a better settlement is with China negotiating. Because if China negotiates this settlement, I think there will be win-win, because this is how they look at their policy initiatives, even in Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. We are now joined on the phone line by Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi's former ambassador. Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. How do you compare the two declarations of the G20 Leaders Summit this time around in India and from that of the last year in Indonesia's Bali? This time around, there is no direct condemnation or mention of Russia for the conflict in Ukraine. What do you think, what made the Western side to concede to this particular joint declaration, which doesn't contain a direct mention of Russia regarding the Ukraine conflict?
You see, there are two points about this. One is that the Russia-Ukraine crisis is a relatively temporary issue. I mean, it is an issue that is current, that is now prevalent. But a couple of years beyond now, this may just pass into history. Some outcome may result, or a stalemate may be sort of stabilized or whatever. The broader issue of the G.
I think we have lost the connection with Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador. We'll try to reconnect to Mr. Ali later on in the show. Mr. Schlanger, what's your understanding of the inclusion of African Union into the bloc?
The African countries, the leaders are very excited by developments recently, where for so many years they were treated as a one-way passage of raw materials from Africa, cheap labor from Africa, and no investment into Africa. Now what they're seeing, and this began with the Belt and Road Initiative, is the Chinese were committed to helping the African nation to develop the technologies and the industry to use their own resources. Now the possibility of that was open now with the G20 means they now have a seat at the table. But that in itself is insufficient. That's why ultimately we need to establish new credit mechanisms to realize the prospects for development. That's partly what's going on with the creation of the new development bank of the Brics, which is talking about funding infrastructure. The Great Inga Dam, for example, which is what the Brics are about to fund, will provide electricity to 6 or 7 African countries which have almost no consistent, adequate electrical source now. So the development perspective is there for the Africans. The leaders are excited about it, and the potential to participate as equal partners, which is what sovereignty means. That's what Xi Jinping and Putin have been emphasizing. We want these countries to have their sovereign voices. And of course, that's also the case for countries like Pakistan, which are somewhat left out of the existing international institutions. So the idea of breaking the power of the unipolar order and creating a multilateral world series of institutions, that's something that the Africans welcome. And I know from talking to African political leaders, they're extremely excited about the potential.
Right, we are now once again joined by Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador. Mr. Ali, please continue with what you were saying earlier before we got disconnected. Please go ahead.
I was saying that I was saying that the Russia-Ukraine issue should not be seen in the same light as the other parts of the declaration. The two important features of the declaration are, the Russian conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict will take some shape in due course, but it is a current and a temporary problem. The broader issue is the incorporation of the African Union. Now, the African countries feel that they have been left out of everything. Like the UN Security Council, they have been left out by all major regional organizations. And they have their own African Union, but they want to be incorporated into global systems. And here, the G20 has included the African Union in its membership. The second is the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Now, that is a much bigger and a more ambitious uh, uh, economic uh, 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 association, which will have long-term effect if it takes shape. There are many problems along the way, but if they can work it out, then it would be a major economic grouping. And the whole exercise of establishing this economic corridor is part of the U.S. and the Western attempt to contain China and to create all kinds of firewalls against what they think is the Chinese threat. There is the Quad, then there is the AUKUS grouping in the east, and then now they will have this economic corridor in the west, and then there are the G20, G7, and Brics. Brics, of course, includes China, but the whole object of the Western countries is to build up firewalls against China. And the attempt is there, but whether it will succeed is not clear. It reminds me of the 50s when the Americans set up the Kyoto and the Senko, and they both died in natural death. So China will continue to emerge as a major economic power. It is causing jitters on Wall Street and the city of London, as was said earlier, and it is something that they cannot really deal with by stopping it or containing it. The best way is to work with it and to have normal relations with China. So this is the global picture, and we have to see how it takes shape and how things work out.
Right, Mr. Naqvi, now when we talk about the response by the Ukrainian side, the foreign ministry has said that regarding this joint communique, there is nothing to be proud of. Now, what's the way forward for the Ukrainians? Do you think that we do understand that Ukraine at this point in history feels isolated because of this Western side signing this declaration without a mention of Russia also?
Well, actually, Ukraine has not been isolated. Ukraine has been supported by the West in many ways, and they are pumping all money and arms, all kinds of assistance into Ukraine. Now, this is, as I said, it's a long-term project of G20, in which Ukraine figures only as a temporary crisis or as a crisis that is current, but it will not be something that should be incorporated or seen in terms of the long-term objective.
Right, Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador, joining us on the phone line. Thank you very much for being with us. Mr. Schlanger, when we talk about, already we were discussing that inclusion of African Union, what sort of potential does it carry for it? Do you think the African Union, the countries, the member countries of the African Union would be in a position in future with their different economies and different geopolitical agendas be able to work in cohesion or in unison to become a member who can play a significant role in the working and the functioning of the G20 in future?
Well, that remains to be seen, and it partly depends on whether the G20 is going to continue to be divided between the G7 nations on the one side and the BRICS and allies of the BRICS on the other. I mean, the idea of multipolarity, while it's good in general, you don't want to have two blocks fighting against each other. And that's the danger. And the Africans don't want to be thrown into the middle of this. What the African nations want is credit for development. They want the opportunity to use their resources and develop their populations, to develop corridors that connect the north and south of Africa, the east and west, and then use the maritime Silk Road, which the Chinese are funding, to have additional connections. So that's what they're interested in. They don't want to be part of a geopolitical game. The whole point of the BRICS is to overcome the geopolitics which have dominated the planet for the last 200 years. The idea that you have to have confrontation between different blocks. Who benefits from that? It's been the benefit of the City of London and more recently the United States as the imperial centers of looting of the poorer countries. So I think the break with geopolitics into a real dialogue between nations, if the G20 can do that, it will be of enormous importance for the future. I'm just afraid that the West is going to continue to use wars like the Ukraine war, conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund, the threats against China, to keep the divisions going for the sake of retaining their own power as a unipolar status.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, we also know there is a development. According to a spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, there was an interaction between Chinese Premier and the U.S. President during the G20 Summit. Now, a Chinese Premier calling for strengthening communications between the two countries. Also, he told Biden that China's development is an opportunity for the United States rather than a challenge. Also, a response by President Joe Biden, hoping that the Chinese economy continues to grow and his country is not going to hinder it. How do you look at this particular development?
Well, I think Biden is not telling the truth. I mean, he's been using the computer chip war. He's been using the development of the issues around the South China Sea, the development of the AUKUS agreement between the British, Australia, and the United States to increase the armaments going into the area. The Japan, South Korea, U.S. military maneuvers are threatening to China and North Korea. So I think Biden can say what he wants about wanting to see China grow and prosper and be a partner with the United States. But at the same time, the U.S. military is preparing for a war with China. And they wouldn't do that without a go-ahead, at least from the foreign policy establishment, people like Blinken and Sullivan and so on. So I think the Chinese do want to have talks. They do want to resolve things peacefully. They're not looking for war, but they're engaged in defensive posture because they don't want to be caught unprepared for what we saw with the expansion of NATO onto the borders of Russia. So I think they take what Biden says with a very big grain of salt.
Right, Dr. Hassan, what's your take regarding this, the statement of the Chinese U.S. president that he wants to see Chinese economy continue to grow?
I think for me, actions should speak louder than words. I mean, words are mere words. If you have Quad and AUKUS and trying to impact even the India, Middle East, European corridor, which the ambassador just spoke about, if it's for containing China, it would have no impact actually. And also in terms of the development which Africa is seeking, and I'm coming back to your earlier question and then I'll refer to what you have asked. If you're looking at, if Africa is looking for development and Africa is looking for the right place in the global economic order, I think they need China. Because China can invest at this time through the Maritime Silk Road and also through the Belt and Road Initiative and even through the global security and global development initiative that China is now looking at. So the engagement that China is having with Africa and the amount of resources that China is pumping in Africa, I think for the remaining countries from the West to have a significant impact would take some time now. And also In terms of how China looks at what President Biden has stated, I think China would look at it cautiously. I think what President Biden has said in Vietnam also was on a similar tone. But for Chinese, I do not think they need wars, and also they're looking at more regional integration and also global integration. Brics, ASEAN, their engagement with ASEAN, their engagement through countries like Pakistan through the Belt and Road Initiative, and even Africa. What they really want U.S. to actually say what they really mean. I mean, there have been certain engagements in the past 6 months, but when Huawei launches its new brand of telephone, cellular phone, I think the kind of discussion that starts in Western media is actually shameful, and also the kind of restriction that U.S. is putting on China, not letting them develop, not letting them even work on the research and development of certain new technologies, which countries like Pakistan and the other developing countries can benefit also. I think these are mere words for me now. But what can happen now, and by using the platform of G20 and in the next summit, I think China would come back more aggressively, will come back with numbers and resources to support African Union. And I for now I'm eagerly looking at the next G20 summit and how that would impact the African and countries like Pakistan also. I would also like to say a few words on regional corridors which are now coming up. And for me, for a person who lives on globalization, who is a scholar on globalization and also works on projects under regional integration, I think any corridor is useful. But if that corridor has a political agenda, if it's meant for something to do in terms of war in future, perhaps dragging countries towards war and through means of corridors, I think it would never have an impact.
So you are specifically pointing towards the rail and the ports deal at the G20 sidelines, which has been unveiled by the US, India, Saudi Arabia and European Union. Because by analyzing, many are saying that it is a countermeasure for the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
I think
so by looking at the weight, which one of these two would carry more weight in future in terms of development?
I think this doesn't even call for a discussion. I think this is a too late and too little agenda that the countries are actually come up with. China was wise, and of course China looks at long-term decision and they make impact based on collective wisdom. I think what Belt and Road Initiative has done in terms of galvanizing more than 1 trillion of economy, creating 420,000 jobs, in Pakistan, like for CPEC, creating opportunities for over 200,000 people, youngsters mainly, 5,000 megawatt of energy, 800 kilometers of transmission line, over 500 kilometers of rural urban synergy and roads. I think for me, this corridor, who would invest in this corridor? Because for now, any country which has the strength to invest in corridors is only China. And the kind of political discussion that is happening, the way that Iran and Saudi are being influenced in terms of getting closer for economic reasons through China, I do not see any positive impact, at least for the time that we have China rising. And I believe that in next 20 to 30 years, I see Chinese economy as #1 economy of the world.
Right. Let me go back to Mr. Schlanger. Mr. Schlanger, your quick last comment regarding earlier in your take, you mentioned this particular rail and ports deal at the sidelines of the G20. You also used the word embarrassing. Could you shed a little bit of more light to elaborate this one, please?
Just to pick up on what the other speaker said, if the U.S. is serious about development, then it should step forward and start offering to participate with China. The Chinese offered to the United States to be a partner in the Belt and Road. And President Trump, for a brief period of time, considered that. American corporations would like to participate. The machinery, the heavy industry, the trade companies would like to work with the Belt and Road Initiative. But if you set something up as a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, this is not about cooperation, because Xi Jinping is clear that what he wants is a win-win policy, mutual benefit for all participants. I think what was presented in this idea is to try to pull the Saudis away from the Belt and Road Initiative, to try to create an alternative. It's not going to work. Especially, it's not going to be trusted by the countries of the global south.
And the one most crucial question Dr. Hassan has also raised, that who is going to invest in this one?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah, please. Who is going to invest in this particular corridor?
Well, you know, the corridors are going to be there. You look at what's going on now with Turkey working out an agreement with Russia, with the corridors that are being proposed now for Africa. This is the way of the future. And if the United States and Europe want to be a part of that future, they're going to have to participate in it. But up to this point, let me just tell you one thing that people don't realize. We're seeing a breakdown of infrastructure in Germany, one of the most advanced countries in the world. The trains don't work, the energy is too costly, there's inflation, there's deindustrialization. The West is in trouble, and it would do really well for the West to look at what China is doing and become part of that instead of trying to compete with it or even go to war with it.
Right, Mr. Harley Schlanger, political analyst, joining us on Skype from Potsdam, Germany. Thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. In the studio, we were joined by Dr. Hassan Daud, senior economist, former project director at CPAC. Dr. Hassan, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching.